On June 17, 2026, the exact same day, Donald Trump stood in France signing the framework that ended the Iran war. China released a white paper. While every camera in the world pointed at the diplomacy in Europe, China announced something that almost nobody outside specialist circles even noticed. A blueprint titled More Just and Equitable Global Governance, China's Principles, Proposals, and Actions. Within hours, nearly 160 countries and international organizations had endorsed it. 160, that is more than double the membership of NATO, and the timing was not a coincidence. While Washington was consumed by Iran, while the financial markets were reacting to the ceasefire, China was quietly building the architecture for what comes after American-led order. This is the story nobody is connecting properly, and today we connect it completely. Before we go any further, you need to understand what was actually signed in Geneva and Versailles over these past few days, because the Iran deal itself contains a structural problem that almost guarantees this story is not finished. Trump confirmed on the sidelines of the G7 summit in France that the agreement with Iran is a memorandum of understanding, not a final treaty, not a permanent settlement, a memorandum. And Trump described exactly what happens if it fails. He said it directly. If I don't like it, we'll go back to shooting at them, dropping bombs on their head. If I don't like it, if they don't behave, we'll go right back to dropping bombs right smack in the middle of their head. That is the President of the United States describing his own peace deal as conditional on continuous good behavior with military force as the alternative. The Council on Foreign Relations published an extensive analysis on June 17th examining exactly what the deal does and does not accomplish. Elliot Abrams, who served as special representative for Iran during Trump's first administration, wrote in that same roundup that the nuclear provisions allow Iran to continue enriching uranium at some level, even with a temporary moratorium, and that although Iran must give up or dilute its 60% enriched uranium, it may be able to retain very large quantities enriched to lower levels. Read that twice. The country that the world just fought a war over keeping its nuclear program in check may keep large stockpiles of enriched uranium under this deal. That is not a small detail buried in technical language. That is the central unresolved question of the entire conflict. Abrams went further in that same analysis and raised a comparison that deserves serious attention. He referenced America's historical support for human rights campaigners like Andrei Sakharov and Anatoly Sharansky inside the Soviet Union, and argued that the current pledge of non-interference in Iran's internal affairs would represent, in his words, a complete abandonment of the democracy movement among Iranians. That is a serious, on-the-record argument from one of the most experienced Iran policy figures in Washington, made publicly and attributed directly to him. It deserves to be heard exactly as he said it, not stretched into something he did not say. Abrams was making an argument about policy priorities and human rights advocacy. He was not describing a covert operation, and that distinction matters enormously for understanding what is actually happening here versus what some commentary has speculated about without evidence. Israel's reaction to the deal tells you something equally important about how fragile this framework actually is. The Council on Foreign Relations Roundup noted that Israelis across the political spectrum expressed dismay about the agreement for very specific reasons. First, the deal allows Iran to continue enriching uranium at some level rather than eliminating the program entirely. Second, and this is the detail that should concern anyone tracking the broader regional stability, Iran successfully linked this nuclear agreement to a separate demand regarding Lebanon. The memorandum appears to call for an end to Israeli military action in southern Lebanon. While Iran is expected to continue supporting Hezbollah, according to Israeli assessments, covertly, if necessary, Israelis believe the United States is tying their hands while Iran retains maintains its most important regional proxy relationship intact. That is being described by Israeli officials and analysts as a defeat for Israel specifically because of how that linkage was negotiated. Whether you agree with the Israeli assessment or not, the fact that it exists and is being voiced publicly by serious policy figures tells you the ceasefire architecture has a built-in fault line between Washington's priorities and Jerusalem's priorities that has not been resolved. There is also a direct financial dispute happening in real time that reveals how unstable the public messaging around this deal actually is. The day after officials announced the framework, Vice President J.D. Vance went on television and was asked directly whether Iran would have access to $300 billion in reconstruction funding. He answered that this is the sort of thing Iran could have access to, funded by Gulf coalition partners, so long as Iran honors its obligations under the agreement. Hours later, Trump posted on his social media platform that the $300 billion figure is fake news. The Vice President of the United States described a specific number on national television. The president called that exact number fake news hours later on his own platform. That is not a minor communications hiccup. That is the executive branch publicly contradicting itself on the single most consequential financial term of the agreement within the same news cycle. Multiple outlets, including Bloomberg News and CNN, have reportedly obtained purported drafts of the actual memorandum of understanding, and reporting on those drafts suggests the written text may differ significantly from what officials have described verbally to the press. When the text of an agreement and the talking points about that agreement do not match, that gap is where the real story always lives. Now let me take you back to what China actually did on June 17th and 18th, because the scale of it deserves to be understood in full rather than treated as a footnote to the Iran story. The Global Governance Initiative was not invented on June 17th. Xi Jinping first proposed it in September 2025 during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin, timed deliberately around the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. It joins three earlier Chinese initiatives: the Global Development Initiative from 2021, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, as the fourth pillar in what Beijing describes as its reconstruction of a fairer international system. But the white paper itself, the formal document spelling out China's principles, proposals, and actions, was released specifically on June 17, 2026, the same day the Iran framework was signed in Europe. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held a press conference in Beijing that day and stated that the GGI had been endorsed by nearly 160 countries and international organizations, with more than 60 countries formally joining what Beijing calls the Group of Friends of Global Governance. Wang explicitly framed the initiative as rejecting what he called the law of the jungle, where might makes right, and as advancing democracy and rule of law in international relations, language deliberately designed to position China as the defender of a more democratic global order against what Beijing portrays as American unilateralism. The substance of the white paper is organized around 5 core concepts that the Observer Research Foundation's policy analysis broke down clearly. Sovereign equality, ensuring every country participates in global affairs. International rule of law for an orderly governance system. Multilateralism for greater solidarity and cooperation. A people-centered approach for inclusive outcomes. And what the document calls real results, meaning a pragmatic and efficient governance process rather than abstract rhetoric. Beijing has paired this framework with concrete institutional commitments. China has signed health cooperation agreements with more than 160 countries and international organizations, dispatched more than 30,000 medical workers to 77 countries, and treated 300 million patients through its cooperation mechanisms. It has signed more than 80 cooperation documents implementing its broader development initiative and established more than 30 cooperation mechanisms across 8 key areas covering all 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. China will also host the 2026 World Artificial Intelligence Conference and a high-level meeting on global AI governance in Shanghai this July, positioning itself at the center of the conversation about how the world regulates the technology that will define the next several decades. The Observer Research Foundation's April 2026 analysis offered a sharper, more critical reading of what this expansion actually represents strategically. As American leadership retreats under a posture of retrenchment, the analysis argued Beijing is exploiting the resulting vacuum not only by infiltrating existing international organizations, but by creating entirely new ones to shape emerging domains like artificial intelligence, space governance, and deep-sea mining before Western institutions can establish their own frameworks in those spaces. The analysis described this as transforming soft power into what it called invisible sharp edges within a broader narrative competition over the future shape of global order. That is a serious, credentialed policy institution describing China's strategy in exactly those terms, not a conspiracy theory. A documented assessment from researchers who study this professionally. Now, let me give you the genuinely important strategic question that emerges when you place these two stories: the Iran Memorandum and the China Governance Initiative, side by side, rather than treating them as separate news cycles. While the United States was consumed for nearly 4 months managing an active war in the Middle East, then managing the diplomatic aftermath of a ceasefire memorandum whose own vice president and president cannot agree on its financial terms in public, China spent that same window expanding a parallel international architecture that does not depend on American participation at all. It does not need American approval. It does not need American funding. It operates through its own development financing, its own AI governance summit, its own coalition of more than 160 countries that have already signed on. The strategic value of that timing is not that China caused the Iran war or manipulated its outcome. There is no credible evidence supporting that claim, and a responsible analysis should not make it. The strategic value is structural and much simpler to establish factually. Every week that American diplomatic and military bandwidth is consumed managing one regional crisis is a week that China's parallel governance architecture continues expanding, largely unopposed and largely uncovered by the same media attention. Let me now give you 3 scenarios for what happens over the next several months as both of these stories continue developing simultaneously. Scenario 1. The Iran Memorandum holds. The 60-day nuclear verification window is genuinely satisfied, and the broader regional ceasefire stabilizes. Under this scenario, American diplomatic credibility is reinforced. The administration can credibly claim a foreign policy win. Attention and resources gradually shift back toward broader strategic competition with China, and Washington begins actively contesting the GGY's institutional expansion, the way it contested the Belt and Road Initiative a decade earlier. This is the best-case outcome for American strategic positioning, but it requires the verification gap that Elliott Abrams and other CFR analysts have flagged: the question of whether Iran's retained enriched uranium stockpiles can actually be confirmed and reduced, to be resolved in practice rather than left as an unresolved ambiguity in the written memorandum. Scenario 2. The memorandum proves to be, as the CFR analysis suggested, essentially an extended ceasefire rather than a genuine settlement, and it gets renegotiated repeatedly over an indefinite timeline, while the underlying disputes over uranium stockpiles, Lebanon, and reconstruction funding remain unresolved. Under this scenario, American attention remains substantially absorbed by an ongoing, unresolved Iran file for the foreseeable future. Trump himself essentially previewed this outcome when he said the deal could be understood as something extended indefinitely while a grand bargain gets negotiated over time. If that proves true, China's parallel governance architecture continues to expand through 2026 and into 2027, largely without serious American institutional pushback, because the bandwidth required to contest GGI expansion competes directly with the bandwidth required to manage an unresolved Iran situation. Scenario 3. The internal contradictions in how the deal has been communicated. The Vance versus Trump dispute over the $300 billion figure, the gap between reported draft text and public talking points, become a genuine domestic political liability that further fragments the coherence of American foreign policy messaging at exactly the moment competing with a unified, well-coordinated Chinese diplomatic rollout would require message discipline. Under this scenario, the contrast becomes stark and unflattering. Beijing presents a single, polished white paper with a clear 5-point framework, an immediate endorsement from 160 nations. Washington presents competing public statements from its own vice president and president about the basic financial terms of its own signature deal within the same news cycle. That contrast does real damage to American credibility, regardless of the underlying merits of either the Iran agreement or the China initiative. Because international audiences respond to coherence and confidence as much as they respond to substance. Here's where I land on this, and I want to be precise about it because precision matters enormously on a topic like this one. The evidence clearly supports several things. It supports that the Iran memorandum signed on June 14th and finalized in the days following contains a genuine documented verification gap regarding enriched uranium stockpiles that serious nonpartisan analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations have identified by name. It supports that senior administration officials have given the public conflicting information about the deal's financial terms within the same week it was announced. It supports that China timed the formal release of a major governance initiative, one it had been developing for months, to land on the exact day the world's attention was fixed on Iran, and that the initiative has already secured a remarkably broad coalition of formal support. What the evidence does not support, and what a responsible analysis should not claim, is that any of this proves a coordinated conspiracy, that China orchestrated any element of the Iran war or its outcome, or that there exists a secret American plan to engineer Iran's internal collapse through the same methods documented in other countries. Those would be extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, and that evidence simply does not exist in the public record right now. What exists is a pattern of two genuinely significant stories unfolding in the same window, one of which is consuming enormous American attention, and the other of which is expanding with comparatively little of it. That pattern is real, it is documented, and it deserves your attention precisely because it is true, not because it has been dressed up as something more sinister than what the record actually shows. The 60-day clock on Iran's nuclear verification is now running. The GGI coalition of 160 nations is now operating. Both of these stories will continue developing whether or not they remain in the headlines. And the central question for anyone trying to understand global power in 2026 is not which single dramatic event defines the moment. It is which institution proves more durable when the news cycle moves on. A memorandum of understanding that its own signatories already disagree about publicly, or a governance framework that secured formal endorsement from a majority of the world's nations on the same afternoon nobody was watching. Tell me in the comments right now what you think matters more for the next decade. The outcome of the Iran nuclear verification process over these next 60 days, or the continued expansion of China's parallel governance architecture while the world stays focused elsewhere. Write your answer below because I read every single one, and that question is exactly the kind of long-term thinking this channel exists to encourage. If this kind of careful, evidence-based geopolitical analysis is what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because we track both of these threads in real time as they develop. The headlines moved on from China's announcement within a day. We are not going to.